uses trade as a weapon to influence the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And I think this will only be taken off if there's either a very unexpected outbreak of peace in the Ukraine, or if India somehow is convinced, unlikely in my view, but to cease or start seriously diminish its import of Russian crude oil. The other 25%, which is still higher than the tariffs imposed on most of the rest of the world, which is 15% for the EU and Japan, and 10% only for the UK, that can only be addressed, I think, by India reducing its barriers on imports.
嗨，欢迎来到果果的新闻频道。各位观众，你绝对想象不到国际局势有多刺激，印度最强天团专家集体开火，痛批美国关税霸凌，莫迪政府放狠话，绝不屈服，特朗普被呛活在幻想里。一边是超级大国的全面施压，一边是死4亿人的怒吼反击。这场世纪经济对决背后，竟藏着俄罗斯石油、中国博弈和金砖国家起义的惊天布局。想看懂世界新次序如何洗牌，点击观看，看印度如何改写弱国无外交的规则，请看前方发来的报道。
Tonight, a brilliant panel. We have Madhav Nalapat, Vice Chairman of the Manipal Research Advanced Group. We have Einar Tangen from Beijing, political and economic expert. We have with us Robert Moran, a political strategist and a partner at the Brunswick Group. We have William Buiter, Chief Economist at Citi and EBRD member, former President, Professor of Economics, joining us from New York. Mr. Buiter, if I can start with you right now. I mean, it is quite apparent to everyone that we have made a choice as a nation. India has made a choice. We were being used as a pivot to push Russia, to push a deal on Ukraine. But we've hardened our position, and being a democracy, when a very popularly elected leader like Narendra Modi does that, he's unlikely to pull back. So what, in your view, will happen next on this issue?
Yeah. Remember, the 50% tariff is a 25% reciprocal tariff, which is imposed because, in the view of the US, India is protectionist and runs a trade surplus in merchandise trade, and the other 25% is indeed a so-called secondary tariff imposed to stop or discourage India's imports from Russia. So they're quite different. The Russia-related tariff is totally geopolitical. It uses trade as a weapon to influence the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And I think this will only be taken off if there's either a very unexpected outbreak of peace in the Ukraine, or if India somehow is convinced, unlikely in my view, but to cease or start seriously diminish its import of Russian crude oil. The other 25%, which is still higher than the tariffs imposed on most of the rest of the world, which is 15% for the EU and Japan, and 10% only for the UK, that can only be addressed, I think, by India reducing its barriers on imports, both tariffs, which for some agricultural goods are 64% or more, or non-tariff barriers to trade that are quotas and other regulatory restrictions. I personally view an early resolution of this issue as very unlikely. It's deplorable. The only good news is that the tariffs are only on Indian exports to the US of sort of physical goods. Service exports to the US are not affected, and of the just under 90 billion goods exports to the US, 45% is not affected by this tariff. So there is still some unrestricted trade, even though the sectors, often labor-intensive ones, affected by the 50% tariff, will be hard hit and have to find other markets elsewhere in the world, which will happen, which will cost time and will involve pain.
Yeah, I think track 4 engagement is continuing with America, but Madhav, do you see any chance, after what the Prime Minister has said in his Independence Day speech, that we will ever open up any of those sections of our economy that America is pushing so hard for?
I see absolutely no chance at all, Arnab. The reality is he is pushing for imports that can completely starve millions of Indian farmers and that can completely destroy the Indian dairy industry. They have excess grain, they have excess milk. Well, given their obesity problem, they need to eat less, that's all. So the reality situation is, here is a man who's telling, you people who are overweight, I mean, I'm not going to define Donald Trump, but, and you're telling somebody who is on the brink of starvation, I mean, that you cut back a little more. It makes no sense. And I can tell you, Arnab, this is not going to hurt very much. Less than 0.5% of GDP, much less, is going to be hurt in these tariffs. And secondly, I just want to add one more point. I think Trump has entered fantasy land. And when you're president of the United States, you have Hail to the Chief, like God Save the King in the UK, and you have a huge flight, I mean, aircraft taking you everywhere, of course, now gifted by the state of Qatar. So you begin to believe that you're an emperor and that you control other people. I mean, even the emperors in the past, I think, were a little more modest in the kind of control they exercise. So I'd like to point out what Trump is doing defies belief, except to say that his main target is the United States itself.
You see, I was always, you're right.
US.
Yes. No, I was always, very uncomfortable with this idea that America wants to use India as a counterweight to China, because we are too large a country to be seen in terms of being a counterweight to China. We have our own interests to take care of. But if I can bring in Mr. Moran, because you're a political strategist, Mr. Moran, I'm sure you'll agree with me that the consequences of these actions are more than economic. Somewhere there's a growing feeling in India that America has been trying to double time a large country like India, and this will have an impact on the overall geopolitical equations, the trust factor, Quad, for example. It'll have a lot of impact on these things. The feeling in India is you can't depend on America. Okay, we may someday work it out with them, can start doing business again with them, but you can never lean on them. We can not even allow them to lean on us. That's the sense that we are getting here. What's your view, Mr. Moran?
So while I'm skeptical of the ability of America to build a managed trade regime, I actually am optimistic about U.S.-India relations. But I think there are three things that are going on here, and I think you laid most of them out in your intro. The first is that the Trump administration is attempting to reset the terms of trade globally. Yes. And they're attempting to use tariffs and the threat of tariffs to do that. And a very traditional Trump negotiating tactic is to start out negotiations very hard and then probe and then find a deal. So that's one. They're trying to reset the terms of trade. That would include India, and that's what you see here. The second, as another guest pointed out, is they're trying to pressure India on Russian oil purchases. So that's the second goal. But they have a third geopolitical goal, which is to develop and build the relationship with India relative to China, which is one of their top geopolitical concerns. So you have three interlocking issues here that I think we're talking about, and it's messy. But a lot of what you're seeing here is very traditional Trump negotiation tactics, where he starts out hard and then begins to work with countries going back and forth. And you see this with some of our larger trading partners in the US and Canada. But I would say, look, it is hard to redo the terms of trade after trade has developed organically between two nations for a very long time. And I think that's where a lot of the fear and friction is right now.
Yes, Mr. Moran, just a small observation before I go to Adele and then I go to Einar, is that I get a feeling that a lot of countries around the world who are rooting for India and Narendra Modi silently right now, which includes the EU, which has compromised reluctantly, which includes Japan, which has compromised reluctantly, which includes even the United Kingdom. I mean, I may be simplistic in this view, but many people across the world, the way they are writing is almost as if they wish their own countries or nations had done exactly what India has done, which is steered the US administration back. You get that view, Mr. Moran?
Well, I think it's complicated. So let's look at the different countries. So we know, for example, that Canada did push back. We know that Brazil has. We know that the UK sought to ink a deal really quickly. So did Japan. So I think it's complicated. I think over time, as more bilateral trade deals are negotiated, we'll start to see the outlines of this. Each country is trying to negotiate what is in their best interests. And so I think over time, as you see more bilaterals negotiated, countries will start to develop more nuanced strategies. But I think this is still very early in this. And this is the messy part about negotiating bilaterally all of these trade deals. It's a lot for any one administration to handle.
Yeah, I think people are uncomfortable anyway. Nobody is comfortable with Trump's approach. May I bring in Adele, please?
That's the point. But that's the point.
That's the point.
He wants them to be uncomfortable. That's why he's negotiating this way. But I think everybody knows that too. They know that this is his strategy, and he always negotiates this way. His demeanor and strategy surprises no one. It does not surprise any international actors. They know this about him. The question is, what is the deal space in the end? That's the question.
No, I get your point. Yeah, but you know, India is upset. We're going to stand back. Adele, you were saying something here. Yeah, Adele.
I think it's great. I'm gonna harken back to something I said during the last time I was on the show, that they know what they're getting with Trump, and that's a beautiful thing. You know, you're knowing what to expect, and that gives them the ability to, you know, preemptively prepare for their response. And I think that this is a temporary policy. It's not permanent. It's a negotiation tactic. And frankly, I have to say, if you put yourself in the same shoes and you see what's been happening to your nation, it's never comfortable. It's never pretty. It's very ugly, of course, at the end of the day for the end users, but it's a temporary reprieve. I think that people are always, this is a form of negotiation and tactics, a strong arm tactic, of course. But I think what's going on is this bargaining chip at the end of the day is going to be beneficial for India and Trump, the US. Freudian slip there. What you're going to end up seeing is that Prime Minister Modi has already done, I think, $12 billion in income tax, I think, cuts. I think he's helped in terms of cutting the losses in some other way to help everyday Indian people in his nation to not be able to feel the effects of this too hard. He's going to be negotiating FTAs, foreign trade agreements, right, with Brazil.
Yeah, but Adele, what is happening here is, I don't want to preempt what anyone's saying. I'd like to welcome Ekaterina from Moscow. She's an international journalist from Moscow. I'll just come to you, ma'am, in a minute. But Einar, what is happening here is something more interesting, because you are dealing with some countries, many countries are ancient civilizations. And I now like to talk about Japan as well. You see, Japan as well. I think Trump tried to humiliate Japan. You know, he imposed 15%, earlier said at 25%. He said 90% of investment profits will remain in the US. Japan will immediately increase imports of American rice by 75%, and agree to additional purchase of American defense equipment, billions of dollars, may work for the short term. I don't know, but I have a feeling there's going to be a major rebalancing in the medium term, not even the long term. Einar, in the context of the SCO summit happening in China, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, what I don't understand is the Donald Trump you see today is no different than the Donald Trump that you saw 8 years ago. He's the same person, as his supporters have pointed out. Trump is Trump. So this idea that this six-time bankrupt, tax cheat, flounderer, whatever, is somehow to be taken seriously, I think is wrong. I think the wrong move was to trust him in the first place. I mean, look at Mexico, look at Canada. He created the big, beautiful bill in his first term. He said it was the most beautiful thing and the greatest between Mexico and Canada. He forced them, once again, using economic threats, to sign on to an agreement that 4 years later he decides is not good enough and he breaks. So this is not somebody you can trust. Now, I really do think that the major issue here is which way India goes. Today, Narendra Modi was very clear. He talked about self-reliance. I think there's another path. Obviously, Donald Trump has made it very clear that he's afraid of BRICS. You don't start belittling something and threatening it because you think it doesn't matter. I heard all the quotes in the beginning of your show. He's concerned. I think that India has a role in leading BRICS towards a more active stance. And I mean, in this instance, getting the 10 countries together, which would dwarf the United States. I mean by it's 4 times more manufacturing. It's the majority of people, land, resources, 40% of the GDP. And they should go and say, look, Trump, you should come and meet with us, humiliate him a little bit, and tell him to knock it off, or this consortium will make sure that he has a very, very difficult time. And as usual, Trump will chicken out. That's his name. It's a nickname. And he's been true to it all along. He only respects countries that push back. India is pushing back, but it is an asymmetrical war at the end. U.S. is a bigger bully, and it's going to be very, very difficult for him to do it. Now, this idea that we should accept it and it's just part of the game, I understand that that's very much of Wall Street. I was an investment banker at one time, and I used to hear this kind of stuff, but it's nonsense. Right? There's no reason for countries to surrender their sovereignty to a bully and pretend that somehow that's all in a day's work. Right? These are proud countries. You pointed it out. These are civilizations. These are not countries that were made up of a bunch of people who moved to another place, chased out the indigenous, and then proceeded to rape, rob, and ruin. So keep that in mind. There are 2 paths that can be taken. Hopefully, India will choose the right one.
精彩视频看完了，这份关于印度与美国近期贸易摩擦的专家讨论实录，揭示了当前国际政治经济中的几个关键且复杂的动向。核心冲突点在于美国对印度商品加征 50% 关税。其背后是双重目的，一半是针对美印之间长期存在的贸易逆差和印度市场的保护主义壁垒，另一半则是纯粹的地缘政治的武器，旨在惩罚和阻止印度继续从俄罗斯进口石油，从而向俄方施压，以结束乌克兰战争。专家们的观点呈现出多重维度。经济学家威廉布策冷静地分析了经济影响，认为此举对印度整体 GDP 冲击是有限的，低于 0.5%， 但会重创特定劳动密集型产业，且短期内解决的可能性极低。莫汉的立场则极为强硬且充满民族主义情绪，他将美国的诉求形容为让濒临饿死的人再少吃一点，完全无视印度数百万农民和奶农的生计，并断言莫迪政府绝无可能在此问题上让步。 他更直指特朗普已陷入幻想之地，其行为堪比帝王，最终目标实为美国自身。政治战略家罗伯特·莫兰提供了相对冷静的分析视角，他将此视为特朗普经典的强硬的初步谈判策略，其最终目标是在重置全球贸易条款，施压印度远离俄罗斯，达成交易。他认为这是混乱但可预见的谈判过程。最后，来自莫斯科的记者的评论最为尖锐，他认为信任特朗普本身就是错误，并强烈主张印度应率领金砖国家 blocs 集体对抗美国，利用其庞大的经济与人口规模反制美国霸凌行为，捍卫国家主权和文明尊严。这场讨论清晰地勾勒出后全球化时代贸易以地缘政治深度的捆绑的现实。美国的单边关税已不再是单纯的经济工具，而是服务于全球战略的复合武器。印度的反应则彰显了新兴大国在面对压力时的自信强硬，其自力更生的战略和庞大的国内市场为其提供了回旋空间。专家们的分歧也反映了世界的困惑，这是一场可以预测并最终通过谈判解决的强硬戏码，还是一场标志着旧有联盟信任破裂，世界走向更激烈阵营的对抗的序幕。无论如何，印度的选择是单独与美周旋，还是引领全球南方集体反击，将成为决定未来国际秩序走向的关键变量之一。这场摩擦远不止于贸易，它是一场关于主权、信任和未来世界格局的预演。谢谢大家观看，喜欢请点赞、评论加订阅，比心，明天见，拜拜。